Another sci-fi film I can recommend is the 2000 film Frequency, starring Dennis Quaid and Jim Caviezel, directed by Gregory Hoblit and written by Toby Emmerich. I really like this movie actually, a strong father-son story involving time travel of sorts. I recently rewatched this one and found that it was actually better than I remembered it to be when I first saw it. Maybe the timeline was changed. The film tells the story of Frank Sullivan, a firefighter in 1969, and John Sullivan, a police officer who's in his 30s in the year 1999. Frank was killed in '69 while attempting to save a young woman from a burning building. John was only a young boy when his father died, and his absence in his life had a profoundly negative effect on him. In fact, it impacted upon him emotionally as a person, even affecting his romantic relationships. John still lives at home with his mother. His mother's name is Julia. She's played by Elizabeth Mitchell. One evening, a friend of John's comes over and they find John's father's old ham radio. He gets it working again and starts playing around with it. And before too long, he starts talking to someone about baseball. So they bond over this and discuss the amazing Mets and the World Series. But it becomes apparent that the other man John is talking to is referring to baseball events as if they haven't happened yet, events from many years ago. The man John is talking to is, of course, his father. The radio signal is being sent back through time because of some timey-wimey superstring plot device caused by a localized aurora borealis phenomenon. The details don't really matter. What matters is how believable the idea is, how well it's sold to the audience. And I have to say, it's executed brilliantly here. John tells Frank where he lives and his name, and Frank becomes suspicious, thinking that this is all some sort of practical joke, or maybe that John is a stalker or con man. Frank says goodnight to the younger John in his time, referring to him as Little Chief. Younger John asks his father to sing the baseball song before bedtime, something that older John remembers his father always did. Older John in 1999 hears this and begins to realize that he is indeed speaking to his father, the day before he's due to die in the fire. He tries to explain all of this to him. Frank is obviously disturbed and accidentally burns the desk with his lit cigarette. The burn then begins to appear on John's desk in the future, but it's as if it had only just happened. This kind of temporal transference happens several times in the film, like a ripple effect, but for some reason only John notices these changes. It's as if his usage of the radio somehow allows him to notice previous versions of history. It doesn't really make too much sense from a logic perspective, but like I say, the execution of the idea is so brilliant in the film that you can't help but get on board with it. He urgently tells his father that he's going to die in the fire tomorrow and how to avoid it. But the signal breaks up. The next day, John has drinks in a bar with his colleague Satch and his friend Gordo to commemorate his father's passing. Meantime, in the past, which is a sentence for obvious reasons shouldn't really make sense, Frank uses the knowledge John gave him to avoid being killed in the blaze. As Frank escapes and falls into the water, this change to the timeline begins to ripple forward, affecting history and also John's memories. Suddenly, he begins to recall new memories of his father. The memory montage, juxtaposed with the shots of Frank escaping into the water, are really exceptionally well shot and edited, showing us that with each change to the past, a butterfly effect ensues. It impacts upon the future. Now, history records that Frank died in 1989 of cancer caused from smoking, but he did live long enough to see his son become a cop. Frank and John chat again over the radio, overjoyed and now fully aware of the miracle that has somehow taken place. John has memories of both versions of history, so it's all very heartfelt and wholesome and everything's great, except that this change to the timeline has other unintended consequences. John discovers that the details of a murder case from 1969 have now changed. A serial killer who was never found, nicknamed the Nightingale, had killed 3 women, but now that's changed to 10 women. This is because a man named Jack Shepherd, played by Sean Doyle, is also now alive again, having been previously dead in the original timeline. And tragically, one of the victims since the timeline changed is John's mother, Julia, who is obviously Frank's wife. Julia is a nurse, and in this changed timeline, she saved Jack's life. So the plot really kicks up into gear at this point, and John and Frank begin working together across time to track down the killer and stop the additional murders from happening, and of course trying to save Julia's life. John instructs Frank on what to do in the past, imparting his police skills. Frank manages to save some of the women by benefiting from John's future knowledge of when and where they will be. At one point, Frank manages to get Jack Shepherd's fingerprints because he touched his wallet. John tells him to wrap it up and store it somewhere safe that no one will find it for 30 years. He stores it under a loose floorboard, under a window seat, and John picks it up in the future. Very clever. Julia is once again restored in the timeline, but the killer attacks Frank and almost kills him, and proceeds to frame him for the next murder. Satch shows up at the family home to take him in for questioning. Frank resists, and the result is that there's a struggle and the radio is knocked on the floor and it's damaged in both timelines. Frank explains the truth to Satch about what's going on, and suffice to say, he's not believed. But Satch watches a baseball game on TV and sees that the predictions Frank made and the very specific details he told him about actually come to pass. Frank manages to escape the police station, and when he returns home, he repairs the radio and finally decides in that moment to stop smoking. This will obviously make another change to the timeline later on. But Jack Shepherd shows up, incapacitates him, and proceeds to assault Julia and then later young John. Future John struggles with the future version of Shepherd at the same time, more than a little coincidental. Frank shoots Shepherd's hand off in the past, and it causes future Shepherd's hand to begin withering away. Reality begins to change with the house transforming around John. Shepherd is killed in 1999 by Frank, who is now alive and well in the present, albeit 30 years older. Turns out his decision to quit smoking in the past, on the advice of future John, resulted in him not dying of cancer after all. He and John embrace, and the film ends with the family all together enjoying a game of baseball. Frequency is not a hardcore sci-fi time travel movie. It's not Primer, it's not Tenet, or 12 Monkeys. The particular time-bending aspect of this film doesn't make a huge amount of logical sense at times. For instance, why does only John retain memories of both timelines? What is so special about his position in the future that allows him to remember the past as it was prior to being changed? Is it his proximity to the ham radio or something? Seems like a bit of a stretch. While no one physically travels back and forth through time in the film, the time travel is achieved through John passing information back through time to his father and his father acting upon that information. But the way in which the changes manifest in the future are less scientifically rational and more magical. Frank and John are talking on the radio. John is in 1999, Frank is in 1969. Frank uses a soldering iron to carve a message for John into the desk. The writing begins to appear in real time, letter by letter, as if the past is happening live. But this feels like a different treatment of time when compared to Frank's survival from the fire. When Frank changed history by surviving, it altered John's memories in the future all at once. But now Frank is changing time by burning the desk and writing on it. Why then is John seeing the letters gradually appearing before him? Surely that change should have resulted in John having memories of both the letters always being on the desk and not being on the desk. But regardless, he shouldn't be able to see them appearing gradually before his eyes. I suppose this could be explained by the open line to the past that the ham radio is creating. The radio is functioning as a kind of real-time, two-way conduit in time. Nevertheless, there's these little inconsistencies that don't make logical sense. Frequency is a film where you kind of have to just suspend disbelief and go with the particular rules of the time travel plot device, regardless of how clunky they may seem at times. Ultimately, the film succeeds in exploring the butterfly effect and the consequences small changes can make in time, leading to causality chains that result in unforeseen outcomes. The strength of the movie comes from the brilliant performances of Dennis Quaid and Jim Caviezel, the heartwarming relationship and chemistry between the characters of Frank and John. This is really what makes the whole film work. It's also beautifully shot and directed, with a striking visual contrast between the warmer colour tones of the past and the darker, colder colour grading of the future. It's rare these days to see a solid and positive father-son story, but Frequency is certainly an excellent example. I think if you haven't seen this film in a while, check it out, and if you've never seen it before, I think you're in for a treat. So let me know your thoughts on Frequency in the comments below. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.